When someone has insulin resistance, they are causing their own cognitive decline by multiple mechanisms.
Hi everyone, Dhru Purohit here. Today's interview is with Dr. Bredesen, creator of the Bredesen Protocol, a step-by-step protocol to get to the root of cognitive decline and Alzheimer's. And we're talking about seven stories from seven different people that went through his protocol and recovered from Alzheimer's. It's a fascinating conversation. Stay tuned. I want to start with a big picture question that a lot of people who are listening to this podcast and are watching this video on YouTube want to know, which is it truly possible to recover from Alzheimer's? It's a loaded question, and some people might even say it's a blasphemous question.
Right.
But you're the man to ask.
I would agree with you. It's blasphemous, but absolutely we've seen it again and again and again. As proof, for example, we just published our trial, proof of concept trial. In that trial, 84% of the people actually improved their scores. So we have unquestionable objective evidence of improvement.
And when you say you publish your trial,
Yes.
right, for those folks that are just new to you
Right.
and are not familiar with your protocol program that you've designed, let's
Right.
give a little bit of context around this.
Sure.
What was that trial trying to look at, and what answers came from it?
Yeah, great point. So way back in 2011, we were looking at root cause. As you well know, root cause medicine is critical. And so we were looking at root causes of cognitive decline. And in 2011, we proposed the first comprehensive trial for people with MCI or Alzheimer's. And let me just digress for one moment to say this concept of MCI, mild cognitive impairment, has really hurt people and the field. When you say that someone has mild cognitive impairment, that is like saying they have mildly metastatic cancer. It is a late stage of the process. Typically, they've had the underlying pathophysiology for 15 or 20 years before they're getting a diagnosis of MCI. And then each year, about 10% of those people will convert to full-on Alzheimer's, which is the end stage of really what is the Alzheimer's pathophysiology.
And just to pause there for a second, if you could rename that, right, and come up with a different term, just to show people the severity and the weight that comes along with that, is there any thoughts of what you would want to call that?
Absolutely. So there are 4 stages. You want asymptomatic, subjective cognitive impairment, mild cognitive impairment, and Alzheimer's. What they should be called is pre-Alzheimer's. That's the asymptomatic period. Subjective is early stage Alzheimer's disease. What we call mild cognitive impairment is advanced stage Alzheimer's disease. And what we currently call Alzheimer's disease is final stage Alzheimer's. So it shows you actually have a tremendous amount of time. SCI itself lasts about 10 years on average. So the window is open. The problem is that people keep saying, wait till next year, your doctor will tell you, oh, you got MCI, it's not that bad yet. No, if you understand that is a relatively late stage of this process, then you really understand that you need to get in as early as possible. We'd like to see everybody who's 45 years of age or older getting on active prevention. We really could make this a rare disease if people would start earlier. People with SCI, which is really a second stage, virtually 100% of those people can get better. As you go on, just no difference than cancer. As you get later, it is more and more difficult to reverse the process. But we do see this in our trial. So 2011, we were actually turned down because it was a multivariable trial. And of course, it's a multivariable disease. So the idea of saying, well, you can only test one thing at a time really makes no physiological sense.
And just to pause right there, just for those that are not maybe familiar with the process of research and everything, I think this is an important thing because you hear so many times, by the way, your new book is called The First Survivors of Alzheimer's, How Patients Recovered Life and Hope in Their Own Words. And this builds on your previous books that were there, all on the topic of Alzheimer's, outlining your protocol that you've put together. So an important thing that's there is that, there have been over, I believe, 400 different clinical trials that have tried to get to to at least have a drug that makes even a small difference when it comes to Alzheimer's and cognitive decline. And largely, all of them have failed, including the most recent one that there's been some controversy about in the FDA. We'll come back to that. And the traditional model of medicine is looking at, okay, what's the one thing that causes Alzheimer's? And then we're going to come up with the one drug that fixes Alzheimer's.
Right.
And you're saying, no, that's not the case.
Right.
Expand on that a little bit more.
So we spent 30 years in the laboratory, published over 220 peer-reviewed papers, looking at what actually drives this process that we call neurodegeneration, starting with Alzheimer's, but looking at ALS and frontotemporal dementia and Lewy body disease and all these diseases. This is the area of greatest biomedical therapeutic failure, as you know. And so when you actually look at that, what you see is there are contributions, because you can literally follow the molecular pathways through a molecule called APP itself, amyloid precursor protein, which is the thing that gives rise to the amyloid that we vilify in Alzheimer's disease. Your body, though, is not trying to kill you. It's trying to protect itself. The amyloid is an antimicrobial peptide. It also binds specific toxins, such as copper and iron in too high concentrations. So this is a response. And so therefore, when you look at the complex physiology that underlies this cognitive decline, the idea of taking this, it would be a little bit like you have a car that has 17 things wrong with it, and you're just going to fill it up with gas and say, let's see if that works. The idea of throwing a single molecule at such a complex brain disease is ridiculously naive.
One
really
pharmaceutical intervention is not going to get to the root issue of this
Exactly.
thing that has so many different things going on.
Absolutely. There are hormonal changes. There are nutritional changes, as you know. There are toxic exposures. You're often making the amyloid because you have specific pathogens in your brain, just as the pathologists have told us for years. When they look in the brains of patients with Alzheimer's, what do they find? They find bacteria like P. gingivalis. They find spirochetes like T. denticola. They find various fungi. They find various viruses like herpes simplex or HHV6. All these things exist in the brain. The brain is protecting itself against these problems. And so our goal then is to identify for each person what are the things that this person's brain is making this amyloid for. The idea of just removing the amyloid is like taking down the protection. And no surprise, you see some dire outcomes, some dire consequences from removing that without removing the root cause problem. So what you have to do is look at all these things. For each person, you're going to find a different profile, and then you need to address that profile with a personalized precision medicine or functional medicine type of protocol. When you do that, people get better. And it's so striking to see. And so that's what the new book is about. 7 people who had wonderful results, who talk about their results and their own journeys to get better and talk about the protocols that they actually used.
It's a beautiful book, and we're going to go into some of those stories. For those that are listening, these stories are filled with really 2 big picture themes. It's the how, right? Because as you've mentioned, there are a lot of variables that are there. You take 100 Alzheimer's patients, they have 100 different there are themes, right? Of course, there's themes, but they're all a little bit different on how they got there.
Absolutely.
And then personalizing their protocol is how they get to the other side of it. And the stories are filled with the how, and they're filled with the hope. I think everybody loves to read or watch, and there's a great video that you put together, a testimonial video about some of these individuals that were part of this book, because really, Dr. Bredesen, the feeling is, and I know you know it, which is why you wrote this book, is that, wow, this person seems normal. Their struggles in life that they went through are the same struggles that I might be going through. You can identify with them. Or you might feel that, wow, I can see my father or my grandfather or my mother in this person, in this patient. And if they made progress, maybe I can too.
Absolutely.
So it's the how and it's the hope.
That's exactly right. And one of the reasons I was so enthusiastic about writing this book was because of talking with these people and because of emailing with these people over time and hearing these wonderful stories, how they got better and how it really changed their views of life. These are people, in some cases, who were told they're going to die of Alzheimer's. There's nothing you can do. As you know, in Julie's case, She went to a neurologist, waited months to get in to see an expert neurologist, and said, look, I'm ApoE4/4. I'm already suffering very clearly. She had gone down in her scores. She said, is there anything you can do, even just to keep me where I am? And the guy looked at her and said, good luck with that. Basically offering her no hope whatsoever. She's gone from 35th percentile to the 98th percentile and sometimes 99th. She's brilliant, great with her scores repeatedly. And interestingly, she illustrates beautifully some of the things that are happening. So for example, she then had, after doing very well, had some backsliding. Why was that? So, again, the theory would say, you're now protecting yourself from something. Let's see what it is. So in fact, she had improved her insulin sensitivity. She had improved her ongoing inflammation. But we knew there was something more. So I kept reminding her, look, you need these additional tests, et cetera. She finally got them. And it turned out, to make a long story short, she ended up having babesia, which was an undiagnosed chronic infection. It's, as you know, a malaria cousin. And she has done even better by addressing that. So you start to address these things and you start getting some improvement, but that sometimes you'll get on a plateau. You need to then find out what is continuing to contribute, continuing to tell my brain, you better be preventing the problem. You better be addressing the fact that you've got either new infections or new metabolic changes or new toxin exposures or reduction in trophic support. Any of those things, but identifying them and addressing them is huge.
And we'll break down some of those pillars and explain them. I want to add one other layer of context for the conversation here as we jump into a couple of these stories and then come back to the clinical trial. And, in the opening of the book, you say that many of us, including myself and yourself, many of us know cancer survivors, right? And often many of us know multiple ones. My mom herself, she was had breast cancer, took an integrative approach, but even people who didn't take an integrative approach or a functional medicine approach, we know many breast cancer survivors, but no one has met an Alzheimer's survivor.
Right.
Talk to us about that.
Yeah, so this has been said for years, of course, that we all know cancer survivors, and my wife included, is a functional medicine physician and has done very, very well and is now 22 years out from her diagnosis.
Incredible.
And yet there haven't been documented people who had Alzheimer's diagnosed and then improved and were true survivors. So these people now, we have people who are over 9 years on the protocol. And the most exciting part about it is when you are addressing the root causes, unlike with a drug where you may get a little bump and then you go right back to declining. And in fact, of course, a few years ago, a paper was published showing that the people who actually went on the drugs in the long run actually did worse than the people who didn't go on the drugs, which is really scary. And so the idea here is the people who have improved and stayed on the protocol will continue to do well. And we have people over 9 years now who are doing very, very well because you're getting at what's actually causing it. So I do think, this is documenting the first survivors, the people who are truly surviving. Now we'll see, is it going to be 10 years, 20 years, 30 years? We hope, of course, they'll be sharp until they're 100, but we don't know yet. The longest ones have been on it a little over 9 years, as I mentioned.
A great analogy that I heard is everybody's fallen, scraped their knee or their elbow, and then what happens? Your body is intelligent, and a scab will end up being built.
Right.
And nobody would look at a scab and say, hey, what is this thing that's there? It wasn't there previously. Let's start peeling that off.
Right.
And in fact, our approach right now in many aspects of health, but specifically when it comes to cognitive decline and Alzheimer's, is let's give a drug that starts to remove this scab off, which is the amyloid plaque that's there. So the entire focus is on removing something that we see as being foreign that previously wasn't there, but we have to realize that the body has a deep sense of intelligence, and many things it does on purpose, except for rare genetic diseases, which are less than, a small few percentage points of the total diseases that people go through. So we have to ask a bigger question. And that bigger question is, why is the scab there in the first place? And why does the body keep on cutting itself? Right. So in that same analogy and parallel, before we jump into a couple of these stories, give us a couple of the main pillars. You've already mentioned them, but in a way that is translated here so everybody can see the different silos and the pillars that can add up to the cuts that end up happening on the brain. Let's just mention a few of them. So you talked about insulin resistance and blood sugar. So that is often a main one that's talked about. So how is that related to Alzheimer's and our brain health?
Yeah, it's a good point. And as you know, over 80 million Americans have insulin resistance. So it's an incredibly common problem. And so it actually contributes in multiple ways. So if you break down the science, what you find is the thing that actually triggers this change. So APP, the amyloid precursor protein, sits at the center of this and is essentially a master switch. So when things are good, much like the president of our country, when things are good, it sends out signals that say build new interactions. It's a growth period. So your growth and support, and that's what allows you to make and keep memories. On the other hand, this is about neuroplasticity. On the other hand, that same master switch molecule, APP, which sits in your neurons, especially at synapses, and to a lesser extent in non-neuronal cells. This is sampling the environment. And when things are bad, it's literally being cleaved, and it's now sending out a different set of signals that say pull back. And by the way, the analogy is direct to what happened with the pandemic. So we had an insult, in that case SARS-CoV-2. We were told, okay, we got to shelter in place. We got to social distance. So things pull back. We went into a protective mode, and what happened? We ended up with a recession. The exact same thing is happening in your brain. When you have these various insults, then what happens is you change the signaling from one of growth and maintenance, keeping and making memories, to one of protection. You're now in a protective downsizing mode. You are losing synapses. Your brain is saying, I'm under assault. I can survive by being less of a brain. I'm going to be a smaller brain. I'm going to have fewer synapses. I'm not going to be able to have the same degree of neuroplasticity, but I will be able to survive. And so it's now making the amyloid that is killing, by the way, the bacteria and things like that. This was shown a number of years ago by professors Robert Moyer and Rudy Tanzi from Harvard. You look at so you look at this as a protective mode. Now, just as you said, as long as you keep the insult, you keep making that scab over and over, you keep having the insults, you're going to downsize. So the insults come in 4 major groups, and you can literally trace the tracks through the molecular pathways of APP. So number 1, anything with inflammation. So if you trigger NF-kappa B, you are going to increase. NF-kappa B, of course, enters the nucleus, turns on hundreds of genes, and 2 of the ones that it turns on are the ones that make the A-beta, the beta secretase and the gamma secretase, which cut the APP to make more amyloid. It's saying, ouch, I'm seeing inflammation, I'm going to deal with these pathogens. So that's anything inflammation, and that can be metabolic syndrome, it can be poor dentition, it can be inflammation from chronic sinusitis, it can be any sort of exposure to different pathogens, leaky gut, all of the above. So that's the first one. The second one that's huge is
because what you're saying is that all that inflammation in the body, wherever it's starting, and we've done a bunch of episodes on dental health and how that's related to body inflammation. All that inflammation will ultimately make its way. It's not just in the body. What you do to the body, you do to the brain.
Exactly. And I think one of the most important understandings is that the amyloid itself is part of the innate immune system. So when we talk about inflammation, we talk about things like NF-kappa B and cytokines and things like that. The amyloid is itself part of that response. So as long as you've got that ongoing inflammation, you're going to be making that amyloid. So just as people died from cytokine storm with COVID-19, people are dying from cytokine drizzle with Alzheimer's disease. It is creating, over the years, this cytokine drizzle. It's a slower process. It's a more chronic process, but it's the same idea. And so, yes, we've got to balance that. We've got to remove the source of that. We've got to first identify the source. What is this? Is this P. gingivalis from your dentition? Is this Lyme disease? Is this leaky gut? Is this chronic sinusitis? Is this mold? And whatever it is, we got to identify it. We've got to remove it. That's the key. And then, but absolutely, just as people looked at using things like dexamethasone with COVID-19, you have to think about how can we also quiet down. So we like to use resolvins, for example. Very helpful. But again, without removing the cause of it, you're going to be in trouble down the road. So you've got to look at both, what's causing it and then how to deal with what's being produced. So that's the first group. The second group, toxins. And they come in three different subgroups, basically. Number one, anything that is an inorganic, things like mercury and things like air pollution. People who've been in the California fires, it's a big issue, just being exposed to that smoke. The people who were exposed to the World Trade Center, by the way, 14% of them developed cognitive decline by 15 years after that event. So it's a huge player in giving you increased risk for cognitive decline.
Incredible.
Very important. And then second group is the organics. So things like glyphosate and toluene and benzene and formaldehyde and things like that. Acrolein, things exposure to fumes from cars and things like that as well.
Scented candles and things that are all over the place. The fragrances that are there.
Scary. Yeah, exactly.
Very scary. We often don't even know the full extent, the damage that those scents do, even though it feels like we want to be surrounded by pleasurable scents. They're wreaking havoc on our body sometimes.
Please be careful. Yeah, over time. And then the third group is the biotoxins. So things like mycotoxins, trichothecenes, gliotoxin, alpha toxin, things like that, aflatoxin, and things like ochratoxin A. All of those can contribute. And the good news is, many molds aren't making these toxins, but the classic ones, the Stachybotrys and Penicillium aspergillus, Chaetomium wallemia, those are the big five to be concerned about. So those are so it's inflammation, toxins. And then the other two are things that if you don't have enough of them, they're supportive things for your brain. And the first is energetics. So we have an equation, and in the denominator, in the numerator are the toxins and the inflammagens. In the denominator, energetics and trophic support. So for energetics, the big four things there: cerebral blood flow, oxygenation, so people who have sleep apnea, huge problem, huge increase in risk. Dropping your oxygenation is huge, and of course you can check it easily you can check it on an iPhone, or you can check it on a watch, or you can check it many different ways to check your oxygenation. Get an oximeter and look at night, for example. The third part there is mitochondrial function that you guys, of course, talk so elegantly about frequently. And then the fourth one is the actual burnable, combustible substrate, which in this case, ketones. So as Stephen Kinane taught us all a number of years ago, you've got a gap there. When you have Alzheimer's disease, you've got poor glucose utilization. That is the signature, the hallmark on a PET scan for Alzheimer's disease, and even for 10 years before a diagnosis, is temporal and parietal reduced glucose utilization. Well, the good news is you can bridge that gap with ketones. So with the combination, and if you can develop metabolic flexibility so that you can now burn both the fats and the glucose, you're in the best shape. So we want to do both. And so you can see when someone has insulin resistance, they are causing their own cognitive decline by multiple mechanisms. They're creating inflammation because of the non-enzymatic glycation of hundreds of proteins. They're also causing a resistance so that you now have reduced trophic support from insulin. When we would grow brain cells in a dish, which we did for 30 years in the lab, you'd always have to include some insulin there because you needed that to keep the cells alive. It is a very important neurotrophic activity. Things like nerve growth factor, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, and insulin are all critical for keeping neurons alive. So you're having this second mechanism as well. You're also having a metabolic component there. You're now losing, you not only have the insulin sensitivity or insulin resistance loss, but you're having the trophic problem as well. So you have a metabolic problem, a trophic problem, an inflammatory problem. You're really ticking most of the boxes to give yourself cognitive decline when you have insulin resistance. And then I should say the fourth piece of this then, the third piece being the low energetics, the fourth part of this then is trophic support. And those come in three groups. So it is growth factors, as I just mentioned, things like insulin and things like NGF and BDNF. But secondly, it is hormones. So this is why estradiol in the past was noted to be a critical support, and a sudden loss of estradiol, as was shown by the Mayo Clinic group years ago. If you have a sudden loss of estradiol at the age of 40 or younger, and you don't get HRT, then you are doubling your risk for Alzheimer's. Even though the Alzheimer's isn't coming till the future, you are increasing your risk starting at that time. And then the third of those three is nutrition. And so getting appropriate vitamin D and appropriate omega-3s and all these things, huge. So you look at those groups, and you can add to that stress, which is another piece of this. It's really a part of the trophic and metabolic piece because of its effect on things like cortisol and DHEA and pregnenolone and things like that. But those are the big groups. If you can optimize those four main groups, you are going to do a tremendous amount with preventing and reversing cognitive decline. And on the other hand, simply throwing a single drug at what you can see as quite a complex problem really doesn't make any sense.
Our diseases have gotten way more sophisticated
Yeah.
as our modern world has gotten way more sophisticated.
Right.
No longer is a single antibiotic or other intervention really the path forward.
Yeah.
The path forward is a multifaceted approach that deals at a root cause level that really is playing with systems biology.
Yes.
Right? So let's make this personalized. We've teased a little bit that we were going to get into some of these stories. So I'd love to pick, one of these stories, and one of them that comes to mind is one of the women that was featured inside of the book. Her name is Debra.
Right. And
the interesting thing about Debra that I think is so relevant to this topic of Alzheimer's is that 20 years ago, you would ask people and talk about the, conversation of Alzheimer's, and it was getting a lot more attention and awareness, but still,
right,
for the most part, even a lot of clinicians would say, well, don't worry about that. That's something that you really have to deal with in your late 70s or 80s. Yeah. But tell us about Debra and when she started experiencing some of the earliest signs. And I'd also love to expand, in these quadrants that you just broke out, inflammation, toxins, all these different areas. What were some of her unique root causes that led her to where she was?
Yeah, that's a great point. So, when I was training years ago, we were taught that this is a disease, Alzheimer's, is really a disease of your 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. This is an old person disease. In fact, some people would call it old timers disease instead of Alzheimer's disease. But what we now know about the underlying pathophysiology is that it starts at least 20 years before that. So what we thought of as a disease of your 60s, 70s, and 80s is really a disease of your 40s, 50s, and 60s that just gets diagnosed later. And in fact, people in their 30s sometimes have the beginnings of the pathophysiology. You can show PET scan changes in some people who are ApoE4 positive even into their 20s. So in this case, Debra, and I agree with you, that it was such a touching story for me just to hear what Debra went through. She's a very articulate attorney, and her description, she watched her grandmother die of Alzheimer's. She watched her father die of Alzheimer's disease, who in fact was a tremendous neurologist. And when he got lost, and she had to literally drive the car and go find him out on the road somewhere, and she did finally manage to find him and get him home. And she said, you really need to have an evaluation. Well, he knew exactly what was going on, and he turned to her and said, "There's nothing that anyone can help me with."
Wow,
which was
how
unfortunate.
Heartbreaking.
It was,
and yet so many families that are watching this now, or people that are listening to this, have been through that experience, right?
Yeah.
Where somebody has no hope,
Yeah.
especially people that are themselves in the medical field.
Yeah. And let me just stop and say something which, again, is a bit blasphemous, but it's the truth. This is now an optional disease. People should not have to get this disease. If you simply get on appropriate prevention when you turn 45, and if it's in your family, you can even do it a couple of years younger than that. Get yourself evaluated, get yourself on optimal prevention, and continue with optimal prevention. You need not be exposed to this illness. And unfortunately, the current standard of care is the opposite. They wait until longer and longer and longer. In Debra's case, she began to notice the same sort of problems that she'd seen in her father when she was in her 40s. So you're absolutely right. A number of the people in the stories said to themselves, wait a minute, this can't be. I'm only in my 40s. But yes, the changes begin that early. And she's a very sharp woman, very smart. So she noticed something's not right. And as she described in the book, one of the things she went through, and she was going through with her car. And trying to say that she was in a commuter lane, and she called out conference call. She started saying things that weren't quite the right thing. She tried to call her dog, and she instead yelled out what she was making for dinner. She knew something wasn't quite right. Interestingly, she couldn't help her kids with their homework anymore. And here's a very smart woman, who graduated with high honors from Harvard. A very smart lady.
And one other anecdote to add to that, in some cases, she couldn't tell people apart.
Right. So and one of the common things, because this is an area of the brain, the parietal lobe, that is affected relatively early on, is that people will have this prosopagnosia. They'll have difficulty recognizing faces. And she had this, and her father had it as well. She had this big time where she would go to some function and she had no idea. People would be coming up to her and saying, hey, should we talk about what we were talking about last week or whatever? She would not know who they were. She wouldn't know the names. She wouldn't know. And so she'd have to figure out things like, oh, if this person has an earring of this type on, just on the left side or on both sides, or if they happen to wear a long red dress a lot, if they happen to be with, a certain dog. So that she'd have certain things she would do to try to remember these people. And as she went to a major university where they told her, yes, you're slipping, you're not doing particularly well in your scores. And so then she ended up, it was her sister-in-law who had read about our studies and who then suggested that she get on the protocol. She got on it, and as most people do, it takes a few months as you start optimizing these various systems. And then, interestingly, she started documenting her own improvements. She started noticing. And one of the things that happened to her after several months, she went to school for her kids. And then she said it was an incredible experience because she actually was able, she said, not only did she know these people, but she knew that she knew them. So she knew right away that it was instant recognition. She knew the faces, she knew the names. So she could see such a huge change in her own ability to source, her own ability to call into usefulness the information that she needed, which is what happens when you're optimizing things.
Tell me a little bit about whether it's her story or some of the other individuals at the first sign of hope where they start to notice a shift.
Yeah.
That not only are they no longer regressing, but they're actually getting back some of their brain function, memory. One of the things that people deal with a lot is skepticism.
Right.
Tell us a little bit about that and some of the stories that you have documented here. Does anything come to mind about a person or the types of skepticism that people face from even their own providers that are trying to take care of them in terms of whether or not they're actually making progress?
It's a great point. I mean, there's always that question like, wait, is this really true? And I want to just go back quickly. And you had asked about some of her specifics.
Yes, please.
And yes, in her case, she had vascular issues with some lipid changes. She had hormonal issues. And she actually had some toxin-associated issues. So, and as with many people, they often have this combination of things. Now, it may be that one is more important than the others for many people, but the bottom line is most people have multiple contributors to their cognitive decline. So therefore, it's really important to identify these. But just as you said, as they begin to notice their improvement, at first they don't want to trust it. And if they mention it to their doctor will say, nothing helps this disease. Just, you're fooling yourself. This is placebo effect, something like that. So in her case, as she finally, after about 10 months, went back to the same university that had not participated in any way in treatment, had only participated in showing her that she was going downhill. And so she was retested. And they said to her, what have you been doing? You're testing much better than you were before. And she said, well, I've been doing this protocol. And of course, as many researchers do, they want to know the one thing. So they say, well, can you just now take away one thing at a time, because we want to know what's giving you this effect.
Right. And so, was it like this, specific dosage of something? Was it this drug that they included in? And I mean, many of your participants in your trial know firsthand because, part of this book is also showcasing the challenges with doing a protocol, right? Making progress and slipping back a little bit, and the unique circumstances that are required to continue and maintain this life if you want to continue to get some of the benefits. So many of them are trained to know, like, it's not just one thing. Right. It's the entire approach that makes the difference.
And this is no different than saying, hey, I had no one in the orchestra pit. Am I going to add the timpani, or am I going to add the clarinets? What's going to make it an orchestra? No, you have to add the orchestra. You have to have all the different instruments. And then the idea of, well, now let's take away the violins and see if it still sounds like an orchestra. No, it's no longer an orchestra. You have to have the whole thing to make it sound right.
Or if you're trying to fly a plane, let's get rid of the, let's get rid of the left wing, right? Let's get rid of the right engine or something like that. Sure, you might be able to truck along for a little bit, but you're not going to be able to continue. You're ultimately going to be able to crash. And I think that this is such a fundamental shift that's happening now in medicine, that as diseases have gotten more complicated, there is more openness and awareness. It's slow. It's very slow. But as you mentioned, you originally got rejected with your trial because it was multivariate. How did you convince the powers to be to ultimately understand that this was a huge part of documenting any progress when it came to this chronic disease? How did you ultimately show them that you need to have a multivariate approach?
This is such a good point. So we were turned down in 2011. So we thought, okay, we need to have anecdotes. Let's show a bunch of anecdotes, because we had nothing back then. So we published the first anecdotes, 10 people, with 9 of them improving in 2014. We had another 10 in 2016. We published 100 anecdotes. In all cases, we had documented approval in 2018. So then after we had that, we thought, okay, 100. They can't turn us down again. We went back in 2018. We got turned down again. Because again, this is not the way people think about clinical trials. We need to now start giving the brain its due. It is a complicated organ, and we need to start thinking of these as complex network insufficiencies. These are network insufficiencies. People are used to hearing about deficiency of vitamin D or of vitamin C. Those are simple insufficiencies. We now need to come into the 21st century and realize that many of our illnesses are complex network insufficiencies, and Alzheimer's is a great example. This is a complex network that has to do with your hormones and has to do with your trophic factors. So we finally went to a fourth different IRB that finally in 2019 said, okay, we'll let you do a small proof of concept trial, which is what we just completed in December of 2020, and which is what we posted on medRxiv this year. And now we're just submitting for peer-reviewed publication, but it's already public now, so that you can read the whole thing in medRxiv.
I think something very important about this, and again, if people are not in the world of research, and I'm not in it myself, but I get to talk to incredible people like yourself that are in it, is when people hear about your work, I often hear about a couple things. It's like, okay, where's the big randomized controlled trial, right? You hear this all the time, even from peers of yours, colleagues of yours that are out there, that's like, okay, I'll believe it when we have a big randomized controlled trial. But research happens in stages, and there's different approval processes. And part of that is you have small showcases and proof of concept trials that then allow for the momentum to build up, the approvals to come in, and also funding, right? Because these trials are expensive to do, and you gradually build your way up. If somebody's ready to hand and give you the approval of, $100 million to be able to do a much, much bigger trial, amazing. But this happens in stages, and that's why this whole idea of like, where's a big randomized controlled trial is really a lazy argument against the work.
It's so interesting. People will try to sound intelligent by saying, well, I don't believe it because there's not a big randomized controlled trial yet. But that's saying I haven't taken the time to look at what's available currently versus what's coming out of the studies you have published. And in fact, if you look at what's available, when there's nothing available, something is better than nothing. It's always easy to say, oh, I want to see a big. And once we finish publishing the randomized controlled trial, they'll say we want to have 2 randomized controlled trial, whatever. So we've gone from anecdotes to more anecdotes to proof of concept trial, and all of these have worked far better than anything else that's been published. And so, yes, now we've gone to the next step, which is a randomized controlled trial. which actually will be started January of this next year. So we'll have these, but as you say, you have to build this up one thing at a time. You've got to show that you're getting results. And by the way, when Dr. Farber at Harvard was trying to develop treatment for acute childhood leukemia, he killed the first few people. Now, we haven't killed anyone by doing this. This is something that actually makes you healthier, which is, again, one of the huge advantages. This is not chemotherapy. This is making you healthier, improving your resilience, improving your insulin resistance, typically improving your waistline, improving your gut microbiome, and so forth and so on. So yes, we're getting the bigger trial will be the next trial, but it does take some time when you're trying to change a fundamental approach to a previously incurable illness like Alzheimer's.
Especially when people have spent, I believe, and you will have the exact figures, but I think we've spent over $60 billion in different, all the trials that have been added up or drugs that have been trying to be looked at. I believe I'll fact check that at the end of this interview, especially when there's been so many, well-intentioned, right? All well-intentioned, right? Trying to find the right cure for Alzheimer's, the one drug, even if it's the wrong approach, it's still well-intentioned. Marches that are out there, fundraisers that people have done at their school or after a family member passed away, or trusting our medical institution, which again, largely is well-intentioned, is trying to find the right thing. But what it sets up is a little bit of, well, we tried it. How is this guy going to be able to figure it out? How is this ragtag group of researchers and doctors who think that they have the answer when we've spent billions of dollars? Yeah. How is it that this almost startup in a way, right? Yeah. This startup is getting to the root of it. So there's already an implicit bias against it because you're not coming with the traditional medical infrastructure.
That's a good point. And that's exactly why we did the research. And, to be fair, the research that we did over the years included grants from the NIH, many, and I'm grateful to the NIH for their support, included grants from the Alzheimer's Association, which is very much against what we're doing currently, even though, yes, we used some of the dollars that we received, thankfully, from the Alzheimer's Association to do the research. But it was the translation. What we found from the research painted an entirely different picture of Alzheimer's than the standard model. So the point here is that you need a model that is predictive. And the model that we realized from the research over the years showed that this is a complex network insufficiency. And so what it showed is that when you're going after this complex insufficiency with a single drug, it's just like saying, we want to put a man on the moon. We've got a propeller plane. We're going to keep building better and better propeller planes, and we're going to get that man to the moon someday.
One way or another, we're going to just will our way
We're just going
to
keep, we're going to keep building a better and better propeller plane, and one of these is going to land on the moon. No, it doesn't work that way. That's not the way space travel works. So we went at it from the opposite side, which is, how does the underlying neural subsystem work? The thing that's critical for this neuroplasticity that has gone awry in Alzheimer's and is literally dismantling itself day by day, week by week, month by month, because you've continued to have exposure to the insults. How do we now address that? So you do have to think about it completely differently. I do think, by the way, drugs are going to be very important for Alzheimer's.
Absolutely.
When you use them appropriately as part of an overall precision medicine or functional medicine protocol, then absolutely.
Yeah. Drugs absolutely have their place, just like antibiotics have their place.
Absolutely.
Right? And we want to also not solely rely on them. We want to get to the root cause. It's a combination of all these things. And as you mentioned, this is precision medicine. This is functional medicine. This is the Bredesen protocol. Let's go to one of these other stories. This one was, really documents the economic impact of Alzheimer's and just how destroying it can be to one's life. And I resonated with this because I myself am a business owner, and I could see that if I wasn't in this field and knowing what I know and practicing all the things that you talk about and my business partner, Dr. Mark Hyman, talk about, that I could see myself one day ending up in the same stage and place. And this was a gentleman named Frank, and he had basically, he was a business owner, and he had lost his life savings. Right. Talk to us a little bit more about Frank and his circumstances and how he found his way to your guys' research.
Yeah. So Frank, went through, just as so many people do, some tough times, realizing something just wasn't quite clicking. He was finding he just wasn't as good at running his business as he was before. And as you indicated, as many people do, started losing out on his business. One of the things he did was to kind of misunderstand what was business related, what was personal. And he started realizing, oh, wait a minute, I'm going to have to loan myself, I have to pay back this. So he really got confused. And so when he realized there was something wrong, and by the way, he went to his doctor who tested him and said, oh, you've got MCI, mild cognitive impairment. And Frank said, there is nothing mild about this. What do you mean mild cognitive impairment? This is not mild. He said, he didn't know how to pronounce Alzheimer's, but he knew he was going to die from it. So it was really a compelling story. And so he then moved to Mexico with the idea that the few dollars he had left for himself and his family would go farther in Mexico. We go further in Mexico with being taken care of. So it was a very sad story. And then he actually overheard some people talking about our work. And then he ended up flying to California, talked to me. We started figuring out, okay, what's causing the problem here. He started getting him on the protocol, and he's actually done quite well. And he is, again, now several years out and continues to do well. And he, like many people, notices that when he then cheats on the protocol, when he then gets off it for typically takes about a week to 10 days, you start noticing, wait a minute, things aren't quite what they were. Your brain is a very dynamic structure, and you notice when you're not making and keeping synapses, when you're doing poorly. And of course, we often notice this because we've had a horrible night's sleep. We just going sleepless for a night or two. And I remember as an intern going sleepless for 2-3 nights in a row. And just by the end of that time, you could barely think. You could barely, you couldn't keep your eyes open. So you're looking at that same sort of process, but over a much longer period of time, where you're literally now dismantling the network within your brain. And so he notices when he does things wrong that he gets worse. And the same thing, by the way, that patient zero noticed, who also wrote a beautiful story. She notices when she gets off 7 to 10 days. She was traveling around the world at one time, and she ran out of some things another time, and then had a viral infection at one time. Any of these things can put you back. And no surprise, by the way, when you have a stressful event, kidney stone, a severe viral infection, a couple of sleepless nights, any of those things, you'll start to see some backpedaling.
These are all different examples of burdens on the body. The body has enough burdens. The classic example in sort of functional medicine is that you have a cup, and every burden, every stress is a drop in that cup. And then enough stressors, boom, 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 and the cup overfills, and you cannot function in the way that you need to. So I think that's an important point, because when we're talking about, sometimes this word cure throws around, that people talk about different diseases. Really, the survivors of Alzheimer's that are featured in this the book, The First Survivors of Alzheimer's, what they're doing is they're maintaining a lifestyle.
Right.
They're maintaining a complete shift in how they approach, especially, diet and these stressors that are in their body, and key categories like sleep and toxins and viruses if they have infections, and then in certain cases, drugs and supplementation. When they get off of that lifestyle, things start to go back. That's actually a beautiful thing, because then it's actually working. Yeah. The tough part for a lot of people to swallow is that it's not a pill to just swallow. It's a lifestyle to maintain. You maintain the lifestyle, you continue to reap the rewards, which, by the way, don't just improve, as you mentioned earlier, your brain health and Alzheimer's. They're going to make your heart health better.
Right.
They're going to make your digestion better. They're going to make so many. You start to think about the body as a system, and you improve that system, you get benefits all along the road.
Absolutely. And that's the key thing to address. I think that people will often say, oh, well, you're just talking about lifestyle. It's interesting, as if lifestyle isn't important. But what we say is no. What we're talking about is what's actually causing the disease. So the whole point of the research and the translation of that research into this protocol has been about the idea of determining what is driving the problem. As you guys talk about, root cause analysis. So you're going to look at what's causing it. And we're finding in these people, we typically find multiple contributing factors from, just to think, pathogens, as we talked about, toxins, reductions in energetic support, and reductions in trophic support. And it's addressing those things. You're now pushing the people onto the correct side of the signaling. You're literally changing neurochemical signaling from a synaptoclastic signaling, which is pulling down, just as you think about osteoclastic activity in osteoporosis. This is synaptoporosis. That's what Alzheimer's is. So you're now changing from synaptoclastic signaling into synaptoblastic signaling, building up and maintaining those synapses, which is just what we want to do.
It's so key, because as we are talking about this, I think that's an important point, because yes, we've done so many episodes on the importance of diet. We've done so many episodes on the importance of sleep, but specifically with Alzheimer's, what you've shown through your research and work is that, okay, there could be people that their diet is pretty decent.
Exactly.
Right? Or there could be people that their sleep is pretty good, but they have such deep environmental toxicity exposures, which they wouldn't have known of if they didn't go to one of the physicians that's in your network that's trained in the Bredesen protocol and the RECODE protocol, and then found out their unique stressor that's maybe one of the biggest ones for them.
Right.
It's definitely multifaceted, but everybody has a big one, or, not big, just one. There's a big few that are there that are the biggest pushes for them. Were there any of the stories that are a good example of how, for one of those survivors, one of those key quadrants was a bigger pusher for them than for some of the others that were there? Is there anyone that comes to mind that you could share?
So Sally is a great example. And Sally was trained as a nursing professor and taught for years. One of the things that she taught people was that Alzheimer's is untreatable. There's nothing we can do about this illness. And unfortunately, she started to develop this herself. And it really also had, her very first symptoms probably in her early 50s, but really nothing enough to push her until she was in her late 60s. And she started having trouble. She would forget to pick up her grandchildren. She had problems with executive function, with planning and carrying out specific tasks and things like that. And so she went in and she was told, they actually did an amyloid PET scan and first of all, they found she was ApoE4 positive. So she had the common Alzheimer-related gene risk factor that 75 million Americans have one copy, which she did. And about 7 million Americans have 2 copies. And unfortunately, if you got 0 copies, 9% lifetime risk, which is not too high, but it's not 0. If you've got a single copy of ApoE4, it's about 30%. If you got 2 copies, it's well over 50%. So she was in a high-risk group. She then had an amyloid scan that was positive. So they put her on a drug trial. And in fact, it was an anti-amyloid drug. So they said, let's remove the amyloid that's in your brain. With each injection of the antibodies, she would get much worse. And we've seen this now in a number of people. Again, if you understand that this is a protective response of your brain, as long as you've got the exposure, no surprise that when you get this reduced, you're going to do worse. Fortunately for her, because we've seen other people that just kept on the trials and got worse and worse and worse, after this had happened to her 4 times, she said, I'm not doing this anymore. This is clearly making me worse. She then heard about the work that we're doing. She started on the protocol. Her MoCA score was 24. She then, over time, is getting a perfect 30 repeatedly. She's done very, very well. It turned out in her particular case, the big contributor was mycotoxins. She had lived, unfortunately, and so many of us do, live in houses that are full of these molds that are making specific toxins. Now, some people are lucky enough, if they happen to have mold in the house, it's not making mycotoxins. In her cases, it was. And so now just
and just for context to add in, sorry to cut you off, these mycotoxins are basically ways that molds protect and sort of fight for their territory. So they're poisons that they excrete to fight for real estate. And that's part of they don't have claws, they don't have fangs, they don't have teeth. So these mycotoxins are poisons, and they're part of their arson to get rid of other competing life forms to fight for real estate.
That's a really good point. So what happens is, if you're a mold, you don't grow as quickly as the bacteria around you. So you're going to get squeezed out of your environment if you don't find a way to fight off the bacteria that are trying to grow around you. Of course, that's why penicillin occurred. They're fighting off the bacteria around them. So unfortunately, some of these mycotoxins, these toxins produced by the molds, they're volatile. They get in the air. The spores get in the air, and often they'll actually even grow in our sinuses or in our GI tract. They're making these toxins, and the toxins, unfortunately, impact our brains. They impact our immune systems. They impact cancer. They increase our risk for cancer in some cases. They can damage our kidneys. So there are all sorts of problems. You get rashes. So your body now is trying to fight back. So you get this unfortunate chronic inflammatory response syndrome, first described, of course, by Dr. Richie Shoemaker. And it is a chronic, so it's a long-term inflammatory response to these toxins, and as he pointed out, to many other things that occur in the water-damaged buildings that typically are the support systems for these molds. And so it's volatile organic compounds and little fragments of cell walls and all sorts of things that your body is now responding to. And unfortunately, just having a relatively poor immune system, not having good resilience, all of the things that happen to us because of our poor lifestyles and the processed food, all this sort of stuff. These set us up not only to have a poor outcome in COVID-19, but to have a poor outcome when we are exposed to the molds and the mycotoxins. And so this is a very common problem, a very common contributor to cognitive decline, and unfortunately not even recognized by standard of care medicine. So if you say to someone, oh, you're developing early Alzheimer's, you better see if you've got mycotoxin exposure. You go to a standard memory center, they'll laugh you out of the room and just say, well, we don't recognize that as a contributor. Well, you better start recognizing it as a contributor, because it's unfortunately a relatively common contributor, and you do need to address it. And I published a paper a number of years ago saying, this is really an unrecognized and treatable epidemic. This is all over the place. And so that's what ended up happening to Sally. As she started to treat it, she started to get better. And as I mentioned, her scores are now perfect. She's doing great. She continues on the protocol. And it comes back to what you said earlier also. She's dealing with the issue of, what do I pay for? What is appropriate here? I don't want to go overboard. It is expensive. On the other hand, the alternative of a nursing home is many, many times more expensive. And of course, the alternative of this new drug, Aduhelm, is also many, many times more expensive and doesn't work nearly as well. So that's the unfortunate alternative.
It's really, we think that this approach can sometimes be expensive, but as you said, we're here in Santa Monica at our studio recording. There's a very famous memory care center that's just right down the street from here that I've been with a few friends to volunteer a few times and go spend time with some of the patients that are there at the memory center. And it's well known because one of our past presidents, Ronald Reagan, was an individual who was staying there at one point in time. And I remember as we were going on a tour, a few of my friends who went to go volunteer, they were like, oh, let's show you around and we'll show you like the room that, Ronald Reagan was in when he was getting treated. And it's a nice place, and we're by the beach and, everything like that. It's Santa Monica, California, right? Yeah. Things are a little bit more expensive. And I remember walking into the room, and it was a very small room, like a very, very modest room. Nice, but extremely modest. And they told me the price at the time, rough range, that somebody would be paying. Yeah. And most likely the president, probably former president, paid himself when he was there. I mean, these are astronomical numbers to have 24-hour care, to have a parent, a grandparent, yourself at a memory care center. And not to mention that the drug, Aduhelm, right, that's been in the news a little bit, the price tag that's been floating around that potentially could have bankrupted us in the economy was, I believe it was like $56,000 a year.
And that's just the beginning, because you still have to pay for infusions. You still have to pay for PET scans. You have to pay for MRIs. You've got to have before and after MRIs because of the fact that it causes bleeding into the brain in about 17% of people. It causes side effects in about 40 to 50% of people, depending on whether you're ApoE4 negative or positive. So it really comes with some huge side effects. And in fact, we'd like to do in the upcoming trial, we'd like to use that as the control.
Right.
The problem is going to be, we'll then have to be very careful about, are we actually hurting these people with giving them some cerebral hemorrhage and giving them some edema in the brain? Is that fair to them to give them that sort of side effects as a control group? What we'd like to be able to do instead, and as you indicated, the costs are just astronomical. The average person, just the average person, $350,000 before they pass away from Alzheimer's disease, much of which, of course, is spent with nursing homes that can often be $100,000 a year or more. It's really unfortunate. So what we'd like to be able to say is, look, everybody, please get on appropriate prevention when you turn 45, or get on appropriate reversal when you have the earliest possible symptoms. And we can really make this an optional disease.
I mean, this is the power of podcasts and books like yourself, is that really we're sounding the alarm that this is something that is both. Again, some people are going to really have challenge with the statement, but it's true. Even though you have challenges with it, you're saying that this is an optional disease now. Now that what we know, this is an optional disease. And that is the truth of the matter. And on top of that, we don't have to wait till you have an official diagnosis to start to make changes that are there. Now, just going back to Sally's story, for example, help us understand a little bit and paint a picture for those that are listening. What was the process of actually her getting treated? Who was she working with and interfacing with, and how did her traditional care fit into that model?
Great point. So she worked with a physician who was interested enough to read about this and to then begin to get her on an appropriate protocol. So what did she do? She went on to essentially the Shoemaker protocol, in which she took specific binders so that she could actually remove the toxins that were within her. She also reduced her ongoing inflammation from these. She ultimately then had the intranasal VIP that was part of the Shoemaker protocol. So she used basically a physician who learned this, who educated himself. So often we talk about continuing medical education, and yet so many physicians are resistant to learning something new. They feel very comfortable with writing a prescription. They don't, of course, unfortunately, many of them are told you don't have time to do more than just quick evaluation and prescription. Fortunately, in her case, the doctor was willing to learn this sort of approach, to apply it to her. And then, this is so important, continue to optimize. And I think this is one of the things that we don't think about enough. As people are beginning to treat these complex illnesses, you've got to keep your finger on the pulse. Did they do a little better? Did they do a little worse? Do we need to change something? Do we need to change a dose? Do we need to now add something? Often, continuing to optimize is the most important thing. And this is, of course, where health coaches have been so helpful to help people to get on the right path and to keep optimizing. Because this, again, it's not something simple you're dealing with. This is a complex system. So you kind of have to wind your way through a labyrinthine sort of protocol to make sure that you're optimizing things for best outcomes. And they'll find that as they change one thing after another, they start seeing better and better results.
And the physician she worked with, again, just expanding out and helping people understand a little bit of your world and all the things that you're involved with, this physician was trained in your protocol.
Right.
So talk a little bit about how many physicians are out there that are trained in this and what that process looks like, and how many of them, including some people that have been on the podcast before, contribute to the larger research and case studies that you're pulling together as an organization.
Yeah, that's such a good point. So we've had over 2,000 physicians from 10 different countries and all over the U.S. who have trained in the protocol, and we just actually had recently Recode 2.0 training. But what you said, I think, is so important. Once you get an accurate model of what the disease is, instead of just saying, okay, we're just going to go after the amyloid or the tau or the what have you, and the next thing. There have been so many different theories. We're just going to go after the herpes. We're just going to go after the P. gingivalis. We're just going to go after the what have you. Go there, fill in the blank. as you now have a model that actually is predictive, what happens is people start seeing, when I change this or change that, I now got incremental improvements, and we're seeing this all the time. Do we need to address plasmalogens? As you know, Dr. Dan Goodnow is a biochemist who's done such interesting work with plasmalogens, and he's arguing that, that's an important piece as well. Other things that come up, what sorts of specific stimulation? It's turning out that things like Violite or things like, specific 40 hertz stimulation, laser, for example, Dr. Robert Hidea has done beautiful work on including specific laser stimulation and has gotten excellent outcomes with his patients. So as we now see, we're beginning to understand what Alzheimer's actually is. Now we can begin to make better and better. So we can do better and better with the idea. It's just like, once you start realizing we're not going to fly a prop plane to the moon, we're going to have a rocket. Now we're going to get more and more sophisticated rockets. We're going to get better and better at targeting them until, of course, we just hear recently that we've got people going up in space without the government here. So we get better and better at being able to do this. And now we've got probes going to distant parts of the solar system. So that's the same thing that's happening here. Just as you said, practitioners are finding, hey, here's an area that actually works better if we add this.
I think the rocket analogy is a great analogy because, again, so many people poo-pooed the X Prize of, getting to space, private flight to space, the stuff that Richard Branson, has been up to, Elon Musk and so many others. Yeah. And we're seeing that that what costs NASA, so many X times more that the private industry is able to do at such a lower cost level. And it's actually, we need a little bit of both because so many of the innovations that have happened in the private industry, just as is happening right now in Alzheimer's, and the innovations that you guys are bringing to the table came from grants, building on top of the soldiers, but shoulders of what the government was able to get started. But we can't just stop there. We can't wait till we have this perfect intervention, because the truth is there's somebody that's listening out there right now that, who knows, maybe one day there'll be a drug that makes a significant more difference than what is the low bar that's been set now, but it's not going to do it if it doesn't get to the root issues of it. But let's say it's a little bit better. What, are you going to wait another 10 years, 20 years, 30 years to get maybe a significant improvement that's even just a little bit better than what we have now? We can't wait. We have to start with something. That's why we're spreading the word about what you're up to. So I got a question for you. Oh, sorry, we're going to jump in?
I was just going to say one thing, because you mentioned the X Prize. I think it's such a good example. One of my favorite stories was from the engineer who designed the X Prize winner, what eventually won the X Prize for space travel. And what he said was that they realized that there was no rocket available. There was nothing in the current approach that would allow them to do what was needed for the X Prize. You had to go up you had to go twice within 1 week. You had to go up to, originally it was 100 miles, and they realized no one could do that. They changed it to surreptitiously kind of to 100 kilometers. You had to go up, you had to come down, etc. So he realized that anything that they suggested that was an inside the box, this is what's already available, this is how we do it, he knew would fail. So he knew that whatever it was that was going to win the X Prize was going to sound crazy when the first person suggested it. And it turned out that what they needed was a rocket that had two different shapes, one going up and one coming down. And so when he first suggested that, they were like, what are you talking about? Two different shapes. So you actually had to change the shape of this while you were flying it. And so I think this is the same thing we're dealing with now. We're changing the idea of, okay, it's just going to be a single drug. Just tell us which drug it's going to be, to no, let's go after the system. This is a deficiency of a subsystem. The drugs are going to be critical for targeting specific things, but let's get larger data sets. Let's look at root cause analyses, and then let's address all of these things for best outcomes. Now we have a very different view of the disease, and now we can begin to make incremental improvements.
It's a fundamental shift in how you look at things.
Right.
It's a fundamental shift. Let me ask you on a personal level, as you were putting these stories together and writing this book, what were some of the themes or ideas that surprised you? Was there anything that surprised you as you were starting to put this together and present these stories for the larger population to read?
Yeah, I was surprised initially by how young some of the symptoms started. And of course, I realized, and again, this really brings back a fundamental scientific point. When you're dealing with something like a disease, there has to be internal consistency. In other words, when you see something on the clinical side, it has to fit what you see on the research side. It has to fit what you see on the epidemiological side. It has to fit what you see on the genetic side. These are all interlocking pieces. And where there's been so much failure in Alzheimer's is that scientists wanted to run with one idea. Oh, I see amyloid under the microscope. Let's get rid of the amyloid. Well, wait a minute. That doesn't fit what you see with the clinical data now. Or they'll say, it's reactive oxygen species. Let's use an antioxidant to get rid of those reactive oxygen species. Well, that doesn't work for Alzheimer's disease. So you have to bring these things together. And so I realized, okay, what we're seeing as these remarkably early symptoms, Debra described changes in her early 40s. Even though she probably wouldn't have been in a nursing home until her late 50s or even early 60s, she was clearly identifying things that were very similar to what happened to her father. Now, she could see what happened to her father as he progressed into his 60s and really got severe Alzheimer's disease. She then looked backward and said, aha, I remember the things he was saying and complaining about when he was practicing neurology way back in his 40s. She realized, oh, these things that I saw as minor changes and, oh yeah, you're just getting a little older, really were the harbingers of severe Alzheimer's. And so to hear these relatively young people talking about these changes and kind of the doctors just dismissing them, yeah, you're in your 40s, you're no longer in your 20s or 30s. They're really telling you this was pre-Alzheimer's. This was the beginning of these pathophysiological underpinnings. So that surprised me initially. But again, seeing the biochemistry, it all started to come together and started to make sense. The other thing that surprised me was how much it made a difference to kind of stick with the critical pieces and how sticking with these and then continuing to optimize turned out to be so helpful. Some people will give up. They'll say, look, I've done this for a couple of weeks. I don't see any major changes. I'm going to move on to the next fad. And so many of these fads, unfortunately, are not scientifically related. It's just, take this pill, take this, you hear it all the time, take this supplement and everything's going to be great. The brain is not that simple. You really need to look more carefully at what's causing the problem. Sure, supplements are an important part. Again, it's interesting. The opposite side is from the academicians who say supplements can't be helpful. Well, wait a minute. Let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater here. These things do help change your neurochemistry. So we are looking at understanding the underlying neurochemistry and then going after those pieces. And absolutely critical things can be helpful. You can't tell me that omega-3s don't change your neurochemistry. That's been shown again and again and again. You can't tell me that resolvins don't have impacts on your neurochemistry. You can't tell me that things like whole coffee fruit extract that increases your BDNF, these things are not having impacts on your neurochemistry. And you can go down the list. Your N-acetylcysteine, your Alcar, your rhodiola, your Bacopa. Understanding how to use these and to target the right things in the right people, these are very powerful, and you just have to know how to use them. So these sorts of things were all kind of eye-opening to me. But the most important thing to me by far was the happiness, the families. For example, with Debra, she knew, watching her grandmother and her father and then seeing what's happening with herself and knowing her own genetics, she turned around and looked at her children, of course. Oh my gosh, what's their future? And so now to be able to say, for all future generations, they never have to deal with this again, that really makes me happy.
Oh, it's incredible work, and the peace of mind that you can bring to the table when you really help people understand that, hey, we want to understand that we've been part of the problem, not in a way that is blaming anybody, but that we as human beings, we've created these circumstances that have contributed to the root causes of the
Yes.
disease that we're facing. That's actually a good thing, because if we created it, we can do something about it.
Yeah.
If this is a random disease that just happenstance falls on us, or some mutation in the genetic code of humanity that all of a sudden just started triggering up and is now affecting the human population, but wasn't really affecting us before, if it's this random thing that was planted here in some sort of crazy way, we can't do anything about it.
Yeah.
But if we contributed to it, that's a good thing, because we can do something about it. And that's the hopeful message
Yeah.
that's there for anybody who's listening. Now, with many of these stories, you talk about the quantifiable improvements in addition to the stories of reconnecting with family, recognizing faces again, remembering important business details and life details, being able to function and operate as a normal human being. Now, on a study level, with the proof of concept study that you did,
Right.
what were some of the key markers that you were looking at to show improvement that you could share here from a group level?
Great point, because, of course, proving this is the critical piece. People will say, well, I'm skeptical. So this person seems, they say that they feel better. What does that mean? So we looked at MoCA scores, so Montreal Cognitive Assessment. We looked at CNS vital sign scores, which is an online assessment, very sensitive, more sensitive than MoCA. So we have the MoCA is better at when you have a more enhanced degree of MCI or early Alzheimer's disease, whereas the CNS vital signs are very good for people who have even mild changes. We also looked at MRI volumetrics, so you could look at things like total gray matter volume, total hippocampal volume. We also looked at what's called AQC, which is a change scale, where you're now getting the partners to say, have you noticed anything? Because there are classic examples of testing drugs where, yes, you got a tiny, tiny change that you can measure, but the partners can tell nothing. They can't tell who's on the placebo and who's on the drug. So we had that way. It gives you a complement. We're looking at brain volumes. We're looking at subjective changes as monitored by the partners. We're looking at objective changes with cognitive scores from MoCA and from cognitive scores from CNS vital signs. And what we saw was 76% of the people had improved. And this is important to note. It's not just a slowing of decline. With the drug Aduhelm, they're not getting people better. They're simply slowing, in one trial only, slowing the decline. In another trial, no slowing of decline. In one trial, there was a 22% slowing of decline. In our trial, people actually got better, so they improved their scores, 76% MoCA improvements, 84% CNS vital signs improvements. Then 84% of the AQ change scale improvement. And by the way, their hippocampal volumes improved and their gray matter volumes improved. Their gray matter volumes actually went up. So we compare with normal aging, there is a slight reduction in gray matter and hippocampal volumes. And then there is a greater reduction if you have MCI or Alzheimer's. These people not only beat the MCI and Alzheimer's, they actually beat normal aging. So they did better on their volumetrics than people that had no complaints that were aging. And these are people with MCI or Alzheimer's who are now being treated. Now, let me hasten to add, for people who had severe Alzheimer's, they were not included. We did the same, essentially a very similar study to what was done with aducanumab. These were people with MCI and early Alzheimer's. So some of them did have true Alzheimer's, but it was a relatively earlier stage. We didn't have people with MoCA scores of 0. Now, for the future, we're interested in doing a trial of severe Alzheimer's patients because we have anecdotes of improvement of those. But no question, the farther along, the harder it is to get improvements, the more that you have to do.
Just like every single disease that's out there, as you mentioned earlier, cancer, right? The sooner that we get into it, the sooner that we can start to make improvements, because there's some fundamental change, at least with the technology that we have right now, that we cannot repair certain level of damage that's been done to the brain or the body.
And that's the question. Can we now improve? What if we add stem cells for some people? What if we have, intranasal trophic factors? There's no question someone in the future will come up with some way, even in very late stages, to turn things around. So we always ask ourselves, what will that person from the future do that we didn't think of? So we want to pull out all the stops. This is as you know, when someone comes in with cognitive decline, either you're going to help them or they will die. And so we want to pull out all the stops to say, what can we do to make people better?
It's so important. And in the future, when they do solve it, regardless of what approach that they have, any kind of innovative technologies, it's still going to be multifaceted. However it works, whatever the way it works, it's still going to be multifaceted. Still, if we develop nanobots that can go inside of the body as like little builders and engineers, they're not just going to be removing amyloid plaque. They're going to be working on all different functions and systems inside the body. It's the difference between playing tic-tac-toe and somebody who's like a master, grandmaster in chess.
Exactly. It's exactly right. And, this brings up the issue of wearables. This is going to be, as you know, this is already changing the way people think about their metabolic status and their cardiovascular status. What's happening now is because of the way our medical system has been set up, it is a sick care, as Mark has pointed out many times. As Dr. Hyman has said to us, we're in a sick care system. We need to now be looking at people much earlier on. So if we could simply capture the earliest changes, we could make it so that all of these chronic illnesses are optional. And so all the wearables, looking at heart rate variability, looking at ketone levels, looking at continuous glucose monitoring, looking at telomere length, looking at oximetry at night, you can now begin to see how someone is doing, and you can pick up things long before they would ever have any clinical and subjective complaints. That is the trick to ridding ourselves of these complex chronic illnesses, because the problem has always been they don't give you symptoms until they're mostly over. You don't get the symptoms of chronic renal failure until your glomerular filtration rate is about 25 or so. You've got about 25% of normal kidney function. If someone could pick it up and say, Drew, you're at 90%. Hey, something you better check in to see what's going on. Oh, great. They've just saved your life. So they've saved you some dialysis at least. So this is the way. I think these wearables are actually going to be very helpful for all of us going forward.
And just pick a couple of them. Let's even talk about continuous glucose monitoring or any one of these that you want to pick up. If we're talking about pre-Alzheimer's, right? Because I'm turning 40 next year.
There you go.
And I'm interested in this, even though, and by the way, there were people, as we mentioned, Debra, that in her 40s started noticing early signs that was there. So this is not just an old timer's disease, quote unquote.
Right.
This is for people at every age that are there.
Right.
If we're looking at this category of pre, most people go to their doctor, and again, well-intentioned, you have 10 minutes, your physical, annual, everything like that. They're like, look, nothing is too bad. Everything is actually good, normal. Yeah. It's in all normal reference ranges. I'm going to send you off. Just keep on doing what you're doing. But then people feel like, I don't actually feel well. I'm putting on weight. I'm not sleeping as well. So what are some examples and some of the things that you mentioned? Because people are always interested, at the full level, if somebody's going to go down the pathway and has early cognitive decline or has a history in their family, they really need to be working with a physician to personalize that, right? That you really do need somebody to guide you through, and that's what you've built, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But for the folks that are listening today that are looking for things that they can do themselves, what would be in that category of that pre-Alzheimer's, numbers, metrics, wearables, whatever that they should be paying attention to?
Great point. That's part of the problem that we physicians were taught end-stage medicine. We were taught to feel for lymph nodes that indicated metastatic cancer. Well, we'd like to pick it up long before that. And so that's why, great things like colonoscopy, very, very helpful, picking things up early, and pap smears and things like that. So picking things up early, critical. And so one of the key points, let me make, brain fog. With COVID-19, what are we hearing again and again and again? Brain fog. That tells you something is not quite right. And you see it with chemical exposures, and you see it with insulin resistance. You see it with horrible food intake. You see it with poor sleep, with high stress. These are all red flags to tell you when you're getting that brain fog. And so, yes, following these physiological parameters really huge. And absolutely. CGM, I think that's fantastic. I also really like things like whether you like an Oura Ring, whether you like Apple Watch. They look at slightly different things. The Apple Watch looks at things like oximetry, nocturnal oximetry, which is very, very helpful. Oura Ring, a little better for sleep. And again, I mean, I'm agnostic. Whatever works, whatever is going to help. Looking at your sleep profile, this thing called Dream 2 that some people like to use is another one. Looking at heart rate variability. And it just shows you how much just appropriate breathing for a few minutes each day, what that can do for your heart rate variability, what can really do for your vagal tone and for improving your stress levels. Of course, simple things, blood pressure monitors. Everyone should know where they stand with these sorts of things. And then looking at your gut microbiome, another critical piece. Through literally doing things that you can do yourself, you can get a tremendous look at your own health and really signal yourself long before you ever begin to have that brain fog that's heading ultimately in the long run for the cognitive decline that is killing about 15% of Americans right now, an incredibly common problem. And just looking at Alzheimer's, as Professor Christine Yaffe has published a few years ago, it is now the third leading cause of death in this country. And for perspective, I should say, it will kill nearly 100 times as many of the currently living Americans as COVID-19 has. COVID-19, as you know, is now over 600,000. Alzheimer's will kill about 45 million of the currently living Americans. There are about 6 million who already have a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. So it's an incredibly common problem. And again, it's just an end stage to the big picture of cognitive decline. So I think a number of these wearables really, really helpful, really interesting. Of course, you can also look at your vascular elasticity. Literally kind of gives you an idea of your youthfulness. And as you know, Dr. Kara Fitzgerald recently just did a very nice study where she showed reversal of aging, where you can really take years off people's lives when you're looking at a methylation, a methylome basically, and then again, doing a functional medicine type of protocol that she set up. And looking at a reversal in aging. And so we're now going to be doing that same thing, and we're working with Kara on this next phase to be able to look not only at improvements in cognition, but improvements in aging itself.
It's powerful. And, like a lot of things, it can be very intimidating in any category of life. If you have ignored your finances for a long period of time, and then you're trying to prepare for retirement, it can feel overwhelming. So it's helpful to get education, to feel inspired, to read stories of hope. And the same thing goes in health. If somebody's listening here and it's like, these feel like so many different aspects, it's a big part of why you've built the network and sort of infrastructure that you have. So let's talk about that. Let's say somebody's listening here and is like, you know what? I want to get some hand-holding down the I want to take the next step and I want to get a little bit more hand-holding. I think, I'd recommend anybody, pick up the book, any one of the 3 books, but especially this one, The First Survivors of Alzheimer's, so that you can feel hopeful. If there's not hope, if you don't see a sense of, I can see the light at the end of the tunnel. Yeah. I can feel excited and know that this happened for other people and it's possible for me. It's going to feel very heavy if you continue down the journey. But now let's say they want to continue down the journey. What of your different resources are out there that they should go to next to get some more hand-holding and find the right people to build and be part of their team?
It's a great point. And no question, having a team that includes often a health coach and or a nutritionist and or physical therapist can be very, very helpful. And again, a physician who can get to the root cause of the illness is huge. So you can either do this, as you mentioned, the books, also looking at just drbredesen.com, and you can look at specifics, and then that will link you. We've been working with Apollo Health. This is a group that is very good with software. And so the future is in algorithmic medicine, is in larger data sets. That's what we absolutely need to get best outcomes. And so we have an approach where we can take specific algorithms and apply them. And again, as we get more and more sophisticated, we'll be able to look more and more carefully at all these different issues. Do you have minor changes in your gut microbiome that artificial intelligence will tell you turn out to be critical? That's the future of medicine, to use these larger data sets. Again, we've practiced medicine over the centuries in a way that is very simplistic compared to the organisms that we're trying to help. And so we need to get more and more sophisticated at what we look at and how we deal with it, the algorithms that we use to get best outcomes.
So you're going to continue to build out Apollo Health, and there'll be more available. But on the most simplistic level, there's people listening all over North America and the world right now. So to find at least one sort of maybe somebody who could be your co-CEO for your health, a physician that can kind of help you build out and maybe they can still find that on Apollo Health and work with you guys over there to really figure out who's in their area that they could potentially engage with.
Absolutely. So you can get that from Apollo Health. The other thing to do is you can go to mycognoscopy.com to look at what are the things that I need to check now. Again, we really suggest that everyone who turns 45 or is older than 45, please get evaluated, get on an appropriate prevention protocol so that we can reduce the global burden of dementia. And if you've begun to have symptoms, okay, please get these treated as early as possible. It's the waiting that's really hurt people. This idea of waiting later and later and later, and your doctor will tell you, well, yeah, you might as well wait because there's nothing that can be done anyway, or you might as well not check your genetics because there's nothing you can do about it anyway. As you said earlier, the arsenal is now huge. We've been told in the past there is no arsenal for cognitive decline, and the reality, it's just the opposite of that. There is a tremendous and growing arsenal that we can all use for prevention and reversal of cognitive decline.
It reminds me, I think I might even mention this last time I interviewed you, I don't remember, but in the 50s, it was considered, standard of care to tell doctors that it was up to them of whether or not they wanted to communicate to their patients that they had cancer. Because they often told them, don't tell your patient, it's recommended, you make the decision, doctor, but don't tell your patient that they have cancer because they could be at increased rate of suicide or they'd be, go into depression and then their quality of life would really go down. But where was that coming from? That was coming from a standpoint of, there's really not much that we could do for these individuals. And in a similar way, not in the same exact way, but that's kind of what's happening right now a little bit with Alzheimer's. Of course, no doctor is not going to tell you, but they're going to say, really, you're not able to do a lot. And here you are saying, no, there's hope and we can do a lot, but it has to be personalized and it has to get at the root if we're going to find that hope.
Yeah, and that's one of the things in common for all 7 of the people in the book. They all were told by their doctors that, well, there doesn't look like there's a lot we can do here. And they all said, you know what, there's got to be something out there. And they all kept with it. They all kind of said, okay, there's going to be something, I've got to find it. And then they all really, when they found it, they really stuck with it, kept optimizing. And I think that's, the reason that they had such excellent outcomes. And I think, having their stories to be able to tell people, yes, there is something. Please don't give up. And here are some great examples. It really gives you some incentive to do the right thing and also pointing in the direction. Here are some of the things that helped us the most. And they talk in the book about, here are some of the things that really seem to help me the most. And each one talks about his or her own protocol.
It's super powerful. On a personal level, if people, and they may say it sometimes in a nice way, sometimes they don't say it in a nice way, but when people call you crazy, similar to, we were talking about the X Prize and the idea of coming up with a shuttle that could be reusable and fly into space and come down to improve the likelihood of, interplanetary travel and research and other things in space. It was crazy. And there was well-established people, top engineers at NASA and other places, again, looking at it from their own limited point of view that said, this is crazy, it's going to fail, it's never going to work. When you hear that about yourself and people say in some version, again, sometimes it might be a little bit more polite, but that you're crazy or we can't get behind this research right now, or we don't feel comfortable telling our patients or our nonprofit about this, how does that, make you feel and what keeps you going?
Yeah, I know it's a really good point. So I actually went to one of the earliest X Prize meetings on Alzheimer's. So there was discussion at the X Prize about an Alzheimer's prize a number of years ago. And so there was a meeting in Boston, and there were about 25 of us or so. And it was interesting. The X Prize team gave a wonderful 2 hours on why they're forward-looking, all the wonderful things they've done with space travel. It was very impressive. And they talked about the history of sailing in the world and how things had to paradigm shifts that had to occur with the changing of sailing vessels and all the wonderful things. Then we went around the room at the end and they said, okay, what should the prize be for? Should it be for a new test? Should it be for something you wrap around your head? And so, of course, when it came to me, I said, well, look, no one's ever made it better. You actually make things better. This was back before we'd even published our first paper. And so I said, there really should be a prize. This is a paradigm shift for actually not just slowing the decline, but making people better. And as soon as I said that, several people in the room said, that's impossible. And here's this group that had just told us they wanted to be forward thinking. It was paradigm shifts. And they're now telling us that's impossible. Well, that's what the X Prize is supposed to be about, things that were hitherto impossible. So I thought that was hilarious. So what I always tell people, if they say I'm crazy, and I just got uninvited from a major television show recently because they said, we've decided that people don't believe yet. The doctors don't believe this. Well, okay, go over the data. So I say, start by reading the 220 papers that we've published, then read the books, then talk to the patients who got better. Look at their test scores before and after. If you still don't believe it, then sit down with me and I'll sketch it out for you. I'll show you on a yellow pad, which is what we started with back in the 1980s, looking at how this disease might work. I'll show you how it works, why it makes no sense to go after this with a single molecule, a monotherapy, and why it is that these people are getting better and staying better. So, yeah, it is interesting to me that truth is often eclipsed by politics and finance. And that's what we've seen, unfortunately, in the Alzheimer's field. Truth has been eclipsed by politics and finance. When you're talking about a $500 billion drug, and that's what we're talking about with the recent approval, it is very hard for truth to win out, because it's just too powerful. The money is just too powerful. And the part of the money, of course, the Alzheimer's Association this is public, was paid $1.4 million, and then of course went on television and said, we think this is a good drug. Of course, that's highly unethical. But this is what's going on right now. So, again, in the long run, the results are going to win out, but it's going to take slogging through a lot of politics and a lot of finance to get the best outcomes.
And I think this vehicle of podcasting, going straight to the source, going to the population who's willing to listen, who's open-minded, is a big part of that. Dr. Bredesen, if you have one ask for our community, because, money, politics, the, medical industrial complex, a lot of medicine, extremely well-intentioned. And like you said, sometimes money can complicate things, and it can have us in every industry, right? In every industry. But you have your own army that you're building. You have your own passionate group of people, which include these survivors, their friends, the advocates, the people that are listening here and are like, I believe this, and I want to continue to spread the message. If you have one ask for those people who are listening today, what would that be?
It would be for everyone to help reduce the global burden of dementia by getting themselves evaluated and getting on appropriate prevention. That's the way you're really going to see a change. And, you're going to be told by the establishment for a while more that, this isn't possible, that don't bother to do this, that I don't believe it, that it's the usual. And, there's a great history. Medicine is just filled with these sorts of things. Of course, Semmelweis, advocating washing hands before delivering babies and getting thrown into an insane asylum for his suggestions and then dying of an infection himself. This is, of course, all pre-germ theory. So people just didn't believe that there were these tiny little things that could kill you. So, the changing belief is going to take some time. Scurvy killed many people would, every century, people would figure out, there's something which ultimately turned out to, of course, to be vitamin C. But what would happen is every century, the medical establishment would say, nah, we don't believe that. And so then it would take another century before they'd come back, before finally people realize, yes, we can prevent and treat scurvy with vitamin C. This is to some extent, these are new kinds of illnesses. These are, as I said, network insufficiencies. They're complex. And I think functional medicine is attacking this very, very well. And so it's going to take some time. And so I recommend everybody, please get yourself evaluated, your family members evaluated, and let's prevent, let's reverse, and let's prevent the continued increase in cognitive decline around the world.
Hey YouTube, if you like this interview with Dr. Dale Bredesen, you're going to love this interview with Dr. Ben Bikman on insulin resistance and how it destroys the brain and the body and creates the right conditions for things like Alzheimer's to grow.
If you can just put a person into ketosis, within hours, cognition improves. Now, I'm not saying you've